Hello everybody. Welcome in to another short, late audiobook stream. Hey, thanks for stopping in, Zatara. I appreciate it. Yeah, I know we're late, but I need to relax a little bit after work, which was, strange and stressful, more stressful than it needed to be, probably. I was the only one in the office today. My boss was sick, and the big boss is still off on set. Didn't even get home until after. When did I get home? 8:30? Yeah, not as bad as some nights. That's why I think these audiobook streams are better suited to the weeknights. Because then, if I get started late, I can, just go for an hour. Call it a night. No stress. Which I think is better. Anyway, for these streams, I try to keep them not too long. And I feel like after a certain point, my quality degrades, but I also don't know. So I tend to do them later at night. I feel like when I was doing The King in Yellow, I was doing my audiobook streams earlier sometimes, so excuse me. Maybe I'll muck around with that. Still trying to see what works. Nearly 500 streams in. Seriously, we're going to do something special for my 500th stream. And thank you to everybody who came out to my last couple of streams. On Sunday, we played the entirety of The Hauntings of Mystery Manor. Classic gothic ghost story game adapted from a website. And on Saturday we played Broken Through for a short horror Saturday. And on Thursday this past week it was more of the Doom reboot, which will be continuing. A good bit more to go. I gotta archive that VOD after stream. Yeah, not a whole lot going on. Me going crazy, but what else is new? Me spilling water on my keyboard. That's not bad for keyboards, right? Could be worse. Could be spilling, I don't know, Irish coffee on the keyboard. Or rhubarb fool. Or the blood of my enemies. To imply that my enemies were in my bedroom. And the only one in my bedroom is me. So tonight we're going to be continuing CRATER'S GOLD by Philip Curtis. A strange, sort of mystery novel from the 19-teens. It was more of a drama. Well, it's got some mystery elements. I guess it's not the traditional mystery as we think of them now. And yeah, we'll just plan to get through another 3 or 4 chapters. And as a reminder, do I have it on screen? Yes. I won't be responding to chat until I'm done reading, and disabled raids and text-to-speech, so I can keep plowing on through. Unless, I get follow-botted or something, then I might have to stop. But knock on wood, haven't had that happen in a good while. And hopefully the whelps upstairs settle down. Chapter 17. Judge Tyler, characteristic enough and aristocratic enough, in a new paneled box runabout, pulled up his horse on the bridge and gazed philosophically at Exberger and Styles, who were standing below on a mudflat of clay and irregular stones that had once been brook. At the clump of hoofs on the boards above, Styles looked up. "Judge, the earth has opened and swallowed our automobile." The judge snuffed in that not altogether pleasant way that he had. "I mistrusted it might," he said calmly. In his hand, Exberger held a guidebook, with splotches of dried clay on the black leather binding, and a torn piece of top cover, the only relics which remained of the car. But as the judge spoke, the lesser of the garage men came up and handed him a second fragment of canvas. Exberger futilely tried to match them together, as if that would prove anything. The leading garage man was kicking morosely in the mud with the heel of his shoe. "I was just coming now to warn you," explained the judge. "They told me your car had fell off this bridge, and, thinks I, if they don't get that out pretty soon, they're like not to get it out at all." Styles looked at him uncertainly. "What is it? Quicksand?" The judge chuckled. "Would you be standing there if it was?" Exberger moved uneasily toward what had once been the shore, and even Styles followed at a more leisurely pace. "No," said the judge, "it ain't quicksand." He paused abruptly and became all attention. "Hark!" he commanded. Even the garage men obeyed the command and stood listening intently, but no one heard anything except the panting of the judge's coach dog under the runabout. For a moment even the dog stopped panting, but, hearing nothing, judged it a false alarm and began again. The mind in touch with the soil seems to fall naturally into anecdote in preference to direct narration. "There was a feller," explained the judge, "come through here 50 or 60 years back with a large herd of cattle. They used to do it in those days. Drovers, they called 'em. Used to come from way up in York State. Canada, some of them. They'd be 1 or 2 men and a couple of dogs. They'd work their way very slowly down through the country, letting the cattle graze by the roadside, buying and selling as they went. Nights they used to turn 'em out in some farmer's lot. Eat a pile of grass in one night, too, a big drove of cattle would. Sometimes they would turn 'em into places they had special near the old taverns, and then they had to feed 'em cornstalks, but that was mostly when they wanted to give 'em salt. In those tavern yards the earth would be trampled down as much as 2 feet below the level of the ground around it. Major Crater, your grandfather," continued the judge, "was living here then, but he was away from home when this drover come along with his cattle, young stock mostly. Bugby his name was. He had a brother that made a fortune selling clocks through the South before the war. I saw him some years ago in Springfield, but this Bugby I never seen from that day to this. Well, seems that day he drove his cattle farther than usual, all the way from Seymour, in fact. It was a dreadful dry year, and he couldn't find no water. So when night come, and he see this meadow with a nice brook running through it, he turned them critters in here without asking aye, yes or no. 236 head in all. Then he went up to the center for the night, this Bugby did, thinking they was all right. But when he come back in the morning, 8 of his best steers was gone, 7 black and white ones, and 1 brindle with a crooked horn. Gosh, he was the saddest man." The memory of Bugby's ire seemed pleasing to the judge's contemplation. He paused for a period that promised to be indefinite, but when Exberger had wondered whether the judge had ever been in the show business, he had spoken more wisely than he knew, for here, with a $10,000 car vanished from the face of the earth and a whole brook gone with it, The four of them stood there absorbed in the tale of the dead and gone Bugby. Even the head garage man had ceased his kicking, while the coach dog panted only in the pauses and stopped to listen whenever the judge began to talk again. "He was mad, eh?" prompted Exberger. "Who?" asked the judge. "A drover? I should say he was mad. He took his whip and went up to Major Crater, surly as a buck maggot. Major Crater, he'd come back then. 'Major,' says Bugby, 'I'd thank you to tell me where them stairs is.' 'What stairs?' says the Major, knowing all the time. 'Eight prime stairs that was in your lot last night,' says Bugby. 'Seven black and white ones and one brindle with a crooked horn.' 'Well, while we're doing our thanking,' says the Major, 'I'd thank you, sir, to tell me who ever gave you leave to turn your condemned stock in my meadow, trampling all the second cutting. And of course,' said the judge, 'he had him there. He come right off his high horse, this Bugby did, hemmed and hawed, and talked about meaning to pay, but that was the kind of man that the old Major was. "Now you look here, Mr. Drover Bugby," he says, "them steers may be right up in my barn for all you'll ever know, but if you don't get the rest of them critters off my meadow just as fast as the devil and Dr. Foster will let you, you won't even have as many as you've got now. And that," said the judge, as if it were the whole point to the story, "was all the satisfaction he ever got. A great man for his rights, the Major was, and, so long as Bugby had trespassed, he was more than willing to let him go on thinking that he had those cattle right in his barn. Course he knew right where they was all the time." "Where were they?" asked Exberger. "Same place your car is," replied the judge. A curious instinct for dialogue, the heritage of both these men, Exberger and Judge Tyler, seemed to bridge all their natural differences and draw them together, to give them the art of handling each other. For all his racial kinship with the judge, Styles had already noticed that Exberger was far better able than he to draw out the old man. The one from his vast fund of folklore, the other from his years of training in the rapid fire of current drama, had acquired an infallible ear for the truth of a story. To get the most from this moment, Exberger did just the right thing. He said nothing and waited. The judge rewarded his listener's talent. "I always understood," he explained, "that it was almost exactly 8,000 miles from here to a point on the outskirts of Sydney, Australia. Just how far your car has gone at the moment, and just where them steers are, I can't rightly tell you, except that they're both some distance nearer to Sydney than we be." "That's all very good," replied Exberger, apparently now at liberty to talk, "but those steers weren't worth $10,000, and my car is." "That's a pile of money," replied the judge. The size of the pile apparently drove all the whimsy out of him, and restored him to a business basis. "Mr. Exberger," he continued, in a purely matter-of-fact tone, "the truth of the matter is that your car has fell into the Eden copper mine." All four of them, even the garage men, looked up open-mouthed. "Then there really is a copper mine there?" asked Styles eagerly. The judge looked at him suddenly, as if, in the sympathetic dialogue with Exberger, he had completely forgotten his presence. "Copper mine?" he replied. "Bless you, yes. That hill o' yourn is one mass of tunnels and passages under the ground. Otherwise, how would old Major Crater have known where them steers had gone?" Exberger, sympathetic as he was for an anecdote, had also a sense of shrewdness unsated. "But look here, Judge," he demanded, "if that car fell in, where is the hole?" The judge shook his head. "You'll have to ask someone more acquainted with such matters than me." Again he paused, listening, and this time his face lighted with satisfaction. "There!" he exclaimed. "Listen there. Do you hear running water?" All 4 of them listened, and this time all of them heard what the judge directed, or said that they did. "There," concluded the judge, "you walk upstream about 30 or 40 rod round the hill in them birches, and, less I'm mistaken, you'll find what's become of your brook." The 4 stood uncertain, awaiting a leader, but it was apparently a rule of the judge's rhetoric that, when no one asked or expected an explanation, one should be given freely. "You ask me where's the hole," he volunteered. "Well, that's something you'll have to ask of an engineer, but I can tell you this, that times has been when the earth caves in here and the water starts running in after it. What happens then I don't know. I mistrust it gets to running and raising hullabaloo all around in those passages under the ground and where's the top thin. For every time that it happens, the stream goes into the earth, up there in that spot that it's going in now, and this spot fills up. Then, when it takes a notice, or perhaps when the water gets higher, it quits going in there and begins to mind its business again on the surface." Over Exberger's face came the same half-credulous, half-doubting expression with which he had greeted Styles's expose of his own apocryphal manuscript. "But, Judge," he argued, "why didn't somebody warn us of that when the car first fell in the brook?" The judge laughed. "Not everybody in this town is as old as I be, and even I didn't know that you and young Puller meant to blow it up like a powder mill. If you hadn't done that, your automobile might have been there yet. The old crick has been behaving itself as long as most people living now can remember. So far as I know, your car is the first as has took the trip since Bugby's steers." There was small consolation in that honor for Exberger. Irresolute, he began the garage man's idiotic plan of digging the dirt with his heel, but Styles had a mind that groped farther back into history even than Bugby's steers. The Revolutionary story came to his mind, and the Unavenged Bride. Vistas opened before him. It was typical that had appealed to him more than the copper. "I wonder what else you would find in those underground tunnels if you dared to go down." A judge snorted. "Young man, if you dared to go down those tunnels and you wore the right kind of glasses, you'd found about $28,000 of your ancestors' hard-earned money and 10 or 12,000 of mine." "As a matter of fact, it was pounds, shillings, and pence that was sunk in that mine, mostly," explained the judge. "But I figured it out once, and that was about what it came to, $30,000 to $40,000, calculating a pound sterling at 4.84. It was not particularly to Exberger's discredit that the denomination of the money failed to suggest to him the approximate date of the copper enterprise. The judge, indeed, took it for granted that it meant nothing to Styles, and he explained, painstakingly, as he was doubtless accustomed to doing for a dull and dispirited generation incurious as to its forebears. "Course we never had any dollars or such things until after the Revolution, nor for some time after. $40,000 then," he added, "meant a lot more than $40,000 would now. 200,000 or 300,000 if you figure it that way." "And all gone to pot?" asked Exberger quickly. "Oh, I don't know, the judge replied. They may have got something out of it. During the war they probably did, but you can put this down for certain. More has gone into that hole than ever come out of it." "Including my car," suggested Exberger. "And Bugby's steers," added the judge, without smiling. Judge Tyler's conversation was, in one respect, like a gas engine. It had every power except that of starting alone. Exberger might have been able to tell the dramatic reason for it, but the fact was that the speaker had to be started with twists and crankings. The first 2 or 3 questions were certain to meet with evasion, if not with downright rebuff. Then, after 3 or 4 minutes of sparring, when all the auditors had given up hope of learning anything, pop! Something would catch, and the judge would be off for as long as anyone wanted to listen. The 3 men were sitting now on the unpainted piazza, in carpet-back chairs, with crocheted antimacassars which had been purloined from the old parlor, and which looked singularly inappropriate for an outdoor life. The judge had had this satisfaction, that exploration by Styles, Exberger, and the garage men had proved absolutely his theory regarding the brook. Around the point of the hill and among the scrub growths, the stream had been found flowing merrily into a hole in the turf, the bubbles and eddies positively crowding one another for chances to fling themselves into the orifice, as if all agog for the novel fun. The judge had received their report with a certain grim pleasure, but had declined invitation to go down and see for himself. He had seen it before, 50 or 60 years back, to be sure, but, like his shipwreck near Singapore and his exit from Harvard College, once in a lifetime was enough for that sort of thing. He had, however, accepted the invitation for the porch. The garage men had left in disgust. They were mechanicians, it appeared, and not placer miners. "No," said the judge, "it ain't so strange that Moore didn't think to tell you about that cave-in. I suppose there's one and another in town has heard the story, but those things get forgot. The last work done in the mine was in 1811, so I've always understood. There was some talk of starting it up again during the Civil War, when they needed metal for making fireboxes of railroad engines. They used to make them of copper then, but they sent someone up to look it over, and they found the vein wasn't worth the working." The judge stopped abruptly and looked at Styles suspiciously. Styles had, in fact, changed expression, but he had never imagined that the judge had noted it. "No," said the judge with a smile, "you'd better not make any plans for taking a fortune out of that copper mine. If there was money to be made out of that, we'd all be living in mansions now where the white birches is still growing." Styles smiled guiltily, and the judge let him off. "No," he said musingly, "mines is for miners, and farms is for farmers, and them as don't have to be either had best keep to something comparatively cheap, like race horses or vain embellishments of the flesh. It hain't troubled me much, what with the stock market and all, but my father had all he could do to keep this town from ruining itself about once a year, with dreams of taking a fortune out of that old mine." The judge chuckled. "And land o' living, I don't know but what he'd better have let him go at it at that." The engine of reminiscence was running smoothly once more, and, as it did at its best, was soaring over the whole field of history. "The Craters was West Ingy merchants from Salem, and not your branch, young man, another branch, but the money come to your family, way back in colony days. They had already settled up here, owning nobody knows how much land, clear up to Spicer, so I've always heard. Then come this idea of the copper mine, and people went crazy, I suppose, just as they do now. Some claim it was in 1771 that they started to mine for it, but nobody knows. They got miners to come here, a dozen or more, men that understood about copper mines, foreigners." "From Wales?" suggested Styles. "No," said the judge, as if it were a commonplace. "They were Spaniards." Styles's newspaper mind raced to the point. Since the evening before, his literary instinct had not been able to reconcile the Bolivian bride with what he knew of New England. In what tangled web of tradition started by Viscayan miners had that myth originated? "There was some queer kind of Spaniards," went on the judge. "Other Spaniards, sailors and such, couldn't understand them." "Basques?" asked Styles, quickly. "What's that?" asked the judge, sharply. "Basques," replied Styles, eagerly. "That may be it," assented the judge. The term did not seem to strike his ear familiarly. "Some of 'em lived and died here and left good Yankee descendants. Miss Fields, her family was one of them. Inchgarry, they was always called. What their name rightly was, I don't know." "The point is," interrupted Exberger impatiently, "the mine's a lemon." The old judge turned slowly and looked at him. For once the dialogue expert had made a false move, and curiously similar, to Styles's eyes, was the way in which the judge turned on him to that in which Mrs. Puller had turned on him the previous evening. It was all equally futile. Exberger did not even suspect the breath of hostility, and the judge did not press his snub. The faintest suggestion of a smile alone crept into the cobweb of lines around his shrewd old eyes. Fantastically, Styles wished that Rose had been there to see it, and with that came the question, where was Rose? For a second, however, he could not ask it, although the mellow thread of narration was broken, and the judge knew that it was. "Yes," he concluded, in a brief and businesslike summary, "that mine is chiefly noted as a first-class ruiner of family fortunes, like a suit in the courts. If they did make anything out of it during the Revolution, it warn't much. It petered out, and then they started it up again, and it petered out then." Reminiscence had been killed so far as he was concerned, and Styles knew that he was free to shake himself and stand up and ask, "What's become of Miss Fuller?" Exberger looked around nonchalantly, as if he expected to find her on the piazza. She seemed to have come into his notice little more than that even when she was present. "I don't know," he replied. "She's somewhere about." "I thought she said she was down there with you," said Styles. He went into the house and found Mrs. Fields. She had a frying-pan in her hand, the bottom of which she was scraping with a piece of brown paper, and at the sight of her Styles thought suddenly of the judge's new revelations. He was ready to accord a sudden respect to her fierce independence, now that he knew that in her veins flowed the blood of the most inscrutable race in Europe, of the slayers of Roland, of Carmen's Jose, and of those mountaineers who, by all tradition, had rolled stones on Charlemagne's army. There was no disgrace in sharing defiance which had been hurled at Christian and Saracen alike. "Mrs. Fields," he began, and, to show the mind of the man, it seemed strange at the moment that he should address her in English. He felt that he ought to be fishing around with a mutual patois. "Mrs. Fields, have you seen Miss Fuller?" Mrs. Fields scrubbed noisily a moment without replying. "She's gone," she answered at last, choosing the moment for her reply when it had the least chance of being heard. On that subject, however, Styles's ears were alert. "Gone where?" Mrs. Fields scrubbed some more. "She didn't say. She took her hat and left me $2. Chapter 19. The air of a man bearing news from a sick room was rather on Styles as he joined the judge and Exberger on the piazza. They had found something to talk about during his absence, but it couldn't have been much, for it died out at his approach. "Miss Fuller is gone," said their host, simply. For a moment Exberger did not grasp it. Then, as it came to him, he sat up. "What?" "Miss Fuller is gone." If nicety of emotion could be measured on one of those neat little charts which are used to show fever, blood pressure, and heartbeat, a straight line drawn through the 3 lowest squares would have shown just about where Exberger lurked most of the time. Then, just as one was relying on that for his maximum, suddenly, without warning, his curve would shoot clear to the highest line, like that of a man who has smoked a cigarette, or envied his neighbor, or done any of the things of which chart-makers, as a class, disapprove. This was one of those moments. By his silence, Exberger atoned for all the excesses of his Turkish manner. He was really touched. It took a certain boyish chagrin like that of the present instant to make one believe that he really was fond of his Rose.
"She needn't have done that," he said. "I would have taken her back if she had only told me." He looked at his watch. "How did she go? By the train?"
Styles shrugged his shoulders, a most un-Styles-like thing for him to do, and one which showed how much he himself was upset. Even the judge had absorbed the gentle spirit of the moment. "There's the 9:58, he volunteered, "and after that there's the 12:06, and then there's only the 6:1 from Felsted." 12:06? asked Exberger, taking out his watch again, for of course he had not noticed in the least what the time had been when he had done it before. It was 12:30, as a matter of fact, but he did not need to announce it. His face told the story. All moments after 12:06 were useless to that little group of three, for even the judge was subtly among the mourners. The judge stood up. "If you are going up to centre," he suggested. Both Styles and Exberger were tacitly accepting of his invitation when a livery car came rattling up the hill. It would have been ludicrous if it hadn't been so wholly nice, the childlike eagerness with which both of them looked at it, hoping that it was all a bad dream and that Rose had come back to them. Instead, it was Baumgarten, smug and bluesergy, and giving a tip to the man who had driven him. "It's stuffy Baumgarten!" exclaimed Exberger. But his moments of sublimity were very short. Disappointment in him, as in most primitive souls, very soon reduced itself to a childish rage. "What in thunder is that old fool doing up here?" If there was belligerency in Exberger's attitude as Baumgarten sauntered calmly up the gravel walk, it was as wholly lost as Mrs. Puller's grand manner had been lost on Exberger himself. Nor was there the least surprise in the newcomer's manner. "'Lo, Charlie," he began calmly. "How are you, Mr. Styles?" If Styles did not always find himself one with Exberger, they were allies in this encounter, but he had some duties as a host. "Judge Tyler, Mr. Baumgarten." "Pleased to meet you, Judge," nodded Baumgarten cordially. "Mornin'," said the judge tersely. Gruff as it was, that was the only actual greeting that Baumgarten had yet received, but it was all the same to him. He seated himself squarely in the middle of the group and looked around at the view spread before him, that $1,000,000 view. Having, on his previous visit, been kindly patronizing to the interior of Styles's house, he was now preparing to be patronizing to nature's landscape. "I see Rose has gone," he began easily. His casual use of the name probably grated on Styles more than it did on Exberger, but it irritated both of them sufficiently to keep either from replying. "Saw her at the station," Baumgarten explained. "Yes," said Exberger quietly. "She had to get back." "They tell me you smashed up the car," persisted Baumgarten. It was evidently not so much a present intention as a permanent habit of his aggressive nature to touch, one after another, all the tactless facts concerning the person to whom he was talking. "Yes," said Exberger coldly. Styles expected at any moment to hear him break forth into violent vituperation, but, strangely, he seemed to be restraining himself. "Either of you hurt?" "No." "Be able to fix it, won't you?" As the two were talking, a curious thing was happening, a thing so curious that Styles was prompted to wonder whether it were real or whether he were merely imagining it. It seemed to be a fact that Exberger was actually afraid of Baumgarten, at least decidedly uncomfortable under his cross-examination. Styles had expected that, socially, Baumgarten would last just about 3 minutes in Exberger's presence. Instead, little by little, Baumgarten was becoming the relentless schoolmaster and Exberger the unhappy schoolboy. That was just the quality of their accent, senior and junior, or, better, father and son, and father on an unfortunate morning. "Be able to fix it, won't you?" Exberger had not been able to answer, and Baumgarten had repeated the question in really a sharper tone. Even that had not been resented. "Hope so." "Where is it?" demanded Baumgarten. It was a long time before Exberger replied. Then he jerked his head in a way not dissimilar to that in which the garage man had done it. "Brook."
Baumgarten made a motion to rise to his feet. "Let's go have a look at it." There was no doubt about it. The judge should have been a stage manager. He rose to his feet with a sudden chuckle. "Gentlemen, I'm going," he said, and it was not until 5 seconds after this rustic intellect had done it that Styles grasped the essence of that incomprehensible dialogue to which he had been listening. The utter ludicrousness of the position in which they were placed, the absolute futility of trying to make a man like Baumgarten believe what had really happened. The judge had, however, saved the moment if it was beyond his power of mortal man to save the day. "Whoa, boy," he called to his horse, as he took the tie line from its neck, but one likes to imagine that he was still chuckling as he took the reins from the whipstock, and then, as he settled down in his seat, called again, "Back, boy, back!" the command which is given by every rural driver, no matter in which direction he wishes the animal to move. The judge rattled over the top of the hill, leaving Exberger and Styles to face the newcomer alone. You didn't stay away long," said Exberger morosely. "I haven't been away at all," replied Baumgarten calmly. "At least no farther than Felsted." He took from his pocket a picture postcard, one done in colors which put nature to shame. He handed it casually to Styles, who read, "First Methodist Church and Soldiers' Monument, Felsted, Mass." "How many of those do you suppose I put out a year?" asked Baumgarten modestly. Styles tried to think of a figure which would be amazing but still leave the art novelty king a margin to spring his happy surprise. 100,000, he suggested. 5 million, said Baumgarten with a grin. When Rose was absent, Exberger evidently played her part. "All of the First Methodist Church?" he asked promptly. Baumgarten's only answer was a look of contempt. He turned to Styles as the man he had come to talk to. "I've done a little business since I've been up here." He left what he would have called an elegant opening for Styles to tell how he had put in his time. But Styles was as non-committal as Exberger, and Exberger had the air of a man with a date to commit murder. That side of it was funny enough to Styles, and, after all, what preference did he really owe to Exberger? Both men, he felt subtly, were fighting for a chance to get him alone, and neither one, so far as he could see in his capacity of host, had any immediate prospect of it. He could hardly come out from the shoulder and tell Baumgarten to be off and about his business. He was not sure that he would if he could. Since that talk with Rose, he had not looked at Baumgarten with quite the same eyes. In the meantime, the three of them were strolling about the lawn, round and round, a sort of endurance contest, all of them talking in monosyllables, no one of them daring to say what was on his mind, the three of them rotating, really, around a vacuum. How Rose would have loved to see it. Rose, whose sudden departure had caused the vacuum. And all the time Exberger still had that uncomfortable air, not at all the manner that one would have expected him to flourish, judging by his previous allusions to Baumgarten. Styles, the cynic, began to wonder whether he owed him money. The thing couldn't go on forever. "Have you seen Puller?" Styles asked, suddenly. Through the corner of his eye, he could see Baumgarten look at him suspiciously, but, being prepared, he managed to wear an expression of perfect innocence. "Yes," said Baumgarten, gruffly, and Styles knew that the news had been broken to him, the news about the returned check. And round they kept going. Exberger finally could stand it no longer. "Say, what is this?" he asked. "A merry-go-round?" Without meaning to, probably, he had forced Styles's hand, but there was nothing else for Styles to do. He looked at his watch. "Pretty near lunchtime," he suggested. "Will you stay, Mr. Baumgarten?" Baumgarten affected an attitude of surprise. "I had planned to pick up a bike in the village." Seeing that he had just sent his car to the station, 2 miles away, it was rather bald, but, at any rate, Baumgarten knew all the ceremonies proper to the occasion. He raised his fat, manicured hands and turned them over doubtfully. If I might wash up a bit, he suggested, politely. Chapter 20. Let him take a bath if he wants to, exclaimed Exberger savagely, as Baumgarten disappeared into the house. He turned to Styles, almost in a whispered haste. We've got to get rid of that boob. Exberger had, in supreme measure, the talent of assuming that his listener's mood was his own, but even he saw that his sudden change of front needed explanation. He paused, disconcerted, not sure just how to make it. Styles, for his part, had learned that his companion was used to a language in which tact was only a casual element. You act as if you owed him money, he said boldly. I do, replied Exberger, not in the least upset. But it's not that. Everybody in the show business owes him money. That's what he was born for. But, good heavens, Styles, don't you see what I'm up against? If he had seen, Styles would still have preferred to get it in Exberger's own words. Stuffy is all right, explained the exasperated impresario, with that grain of charity with which both he and Rose seemed to qualify every harsh statement. But he's a joke. He's a mark. He's a professional easy thing. And he knows it. He can't help knowing it. As long as I can remember, he's been our pet goat. In his own line, I guess he's no fool. But he's like lots of others. He's actor bit. Anybody in the show business, he'll give anything just to be seen with them. And that's the trouble. He knows them all. Just let him get it into his noodle what's really happened to that car, and, after all these years of my kidding him, say, what will he do to me? What will he do to little George G. me? To tell the truth, while he saw the point, it seemed to Styles that Exberger was making a mountain out of a molehill. His attitude showed it, for Exberger turned in exasperation. Now I ask you, who will believe that story when once Stuffy Baumgarten begins to spread it on Broadway? A $10,000 car doing a fadeaway into the ground, lost, gone, covered up, not even the speedometer, while we, like a bunch of goops, sit here and let it melt. Would you believe it if you heard it? No, I don't think I should, Styles had to confess. Well then, demanded Exberger, what makes you think that anyone else will believe it? He seemed to assume that Styles had maintained that it was an everyday event, but Styles saw that it was useless to protest. You don't seem to get it, continued Exberger, wilder than ever. Why, there won't be a musical show on Broadway next fall that won't have something about it. There won't be a country newspaper next week that won't have something about that cock and bull story. And all the while the wise guys will be sitting around and saying, now just what was the real dope about Exberger's car? Then they'll begin explaining. There'll always be someone to wink his eye and nod his head and tap your knee and say, now this is just between you and I, but I've got it straight from a man who knows that. Well, there's something behind that story that you haven't heard. Why, man alive, Exberger ranted on, there'll be stories that I haven't drawn a sober breath in 3 years. I won't mind that, because they say that of everybody when they can't think of anything else to say. But then the funny boys will get hold of it. He tried to make us think that his car went on the blink, they'll say. They'll say I smashed it up on a spree. They'll say I hawked it. Sooner or later, they'll say that I had never had any car at all. Can you see what will happen to me the minute I get to the city? He paused, still fuming, but suddenly his whole manner changed, and he added, quietly, besides, there's Rose. Now you're talking. Styles did not say it aloud, but he thought it, and immediately there followed the finest moment in his whole acquaintance with Exberger. Damn it, Styles, the show business gets it in the eye every time, he said quietly, almost fiercely. You know there was nothing queer in me being up here with Rose, don't you? Even the second that Styles took to reply was not short enough, and he insisted, don't you? Of course I know it, replied Styles, and Exberger went on. What in the world are we to do? Sit in our room with our hands in our laps? She hasn't got any home. I haven't got any home. We're not 6 years old. Styles thought again of his conversation with Rose that morning. You don't suppose that Baumgarten is going to spread that side of it, do you? No, said Exberger slowly. But leaks, Styles, leaks. If the story gets out at all, you might just as well try to stop the ocean as cover a thing like that. From that point of view, Styles was enlisted, as he had been the moment that Rose's name had been mentioned. Before that, having accepted the whole situation, he had not questioned any of its minor ethics. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I wish you'd tell me," said Exberger. "So far as I can see, we've got to dig it out sooner or later. I suppose it will cost $30,000 to $40,000, said Styles, smiling, according to the judge. Exberger, however, was not in a rollicking mood. He walked peevishly back and forth across the piazza, but Styles had an inspiration. "Look here," he exclaimed, borrowing a bit of Exberger's own enthusiasm. "Why don't you let it stay just where it is?" Exberger stopped walking and looked at him in query. "You said last night that it was insured." Exberger nodded, but before Styles could add another word, they both saw the flaw. Exberger voiced it. "Say," he exclaimed, "I'd have a fat chance to get any money out of any insurance company with that pipe dream. They'd make me show every spoke in the wheels." There was logic in this, and Styles had no more to say. "Unless your tame brook coughs it up in an hour or two," mused Exberger, fretfully. "The only thing that I can think of is to tell Stuffy that the car had been taken to the garage, and then have it dug out secretly at night. And there we are. We've got to act soon. Suppose the brook starts business again. How are we going to dig down through the water? If we do it at all, we'll have to do it tonight at midnight. What do you think of that plan?" Styles did not think much of it. "In the first place," he said, "it wouldn't do any good. The garage men know about it already. The judge knows about it. Safe to say that everybody in town knows about it. If Baumgarten stays here half an hour longer, he will know about it too. If I were you, I would simply tell him and ask him to keep it quiet." Exberger shook his head vehemently. "Nothing doing. Stuffy's been waiting 5 years for a chance of this kind." Except for Rose, Styles did not have very much patience with this mighty issue erected on nothing but Exberger's own vanity, but the thing did appeal to his sense of humor. He looked contemplatively toward the lawn, and then he suggested suddenly, "If that hill is a honeycomb of underground passages, I wonder if there isn't some other way to get at it." "Oh, don't be an ass, Styles," exclaimed Exberger, as if he himself had been talking nothing but sense. Then the potency of that haunted house slowly caught him as it had the evening before. He wavered a moment or two, and then he said, tentatively, "Let's go have a look at that thing. I haven't had a really decent look at it yet." Together they started across the lawn slowly, when a voice behind them boomed out, "Well, gentlemen." Styles started to turn, but Exberger grabbed his arm. "Quick," he said. "There's Stuffy. What are we going to tell him?" "The truth, I guess," replied Styles. Pretending, nevertheless, not to have heard the voice, the two continued their walk until they paused on the rampart of the old cellar. Over his shoulder, Styles noticed that Baumgarten was following with the air of a king looking over his realm. "Look here," he said, speaking rapidly, and only because he knew that Exberger was not the only man who would suffer did he say what he did. "Look here, isn't there any one person in the world who can keep him from saying a word?" For a second, not knowing what Styles had learned that morning, Exberger did not grasp it. "Who—" he began, and then it flashed over him. In violent congratulation he held out his hand. "Styles, you're a genius!" "Brother Elks, Mr. Mayor, and visiting firemen," declared Baumgarten, seeing the gesture. He looked rather curious as to its meaning, but he did not ask explanation. "Out inspecting your property, Mr. Styles," he began. Then he stopped short and looked at the rampart on which they were standing. "Hello!" he exclaimed, and looked at the rampart again. "Styles," he said, suddenly, for the first time using the familiar term, I bet I know something you don't know. Ah, Stuffy, you know things that nobody knows, broke in Exburger, his poise completely restored. But Baumgarten paid no attention to him. He stared at the pile of turf and debris as if to make sure, and then he went on. Did you know that you owned a copper mine? Styles looked at Exburger, and Exburger looked at Styles. Yes, I did know it, answered Styles, but he had hesitated just a moment too long, and, as Rose had said, Baumgarten was not such a fool as he had the reputation of being. How long have you known it? He insisted, mercilessly. Having just posed to Exburger as an apostle of truth, Styles felt it incumbent on him to blaze the way. About 2 hours, he answered. How long have you? About 3 minutes, confessed Baumgarten with equal frankness. I wondered who owned that mine. He fished in his pocket again and brought out a brown envelope full of his picture cards. Sorting them over, he handed one to Styles. It showed, sure enough, the rampart on which they were standing, and underneath it the legend, Old Copper Mine, Eden, Mass. Where do you suppose the guy had those? Continued Baumgarten. What guy? Asked Exburger. The guy in the drugstore, underneath a pile of candy boxes in the back room. No wonder he never sold any. Why don't you work that mine, Styles? It's a quince, explained Exburger promptly. So, replied Baumgarten, looking at it musingly, copper's valuable now. It may have existed only in the 2 timorous minds with which he was dealing, but it still seemed to be a fact that Baumgarten had complete control of this little encounter. He turned in a lordly manner to stroll back toward the house, and the 2 others followed, lamb-like. How do you know? He began, and then his face brightened. Well, look who's here. Chapter 21. It was Rose, true enough, but Rose looked tired and not very happy. She had come from the village on foot. The 3 men simultaneously broke into what was almost a run and met her at the end of the gravel path. What's the matter, Rose? Exclaimed Exburger. Did you miss the train? The girl shook her head, but gave no other sign of wishing to answer. Solicitously the 3 men followed her to the piazza, as kittens follow a cat, and Styles brought out one of the carpet-backed chairs. She sank into it wearily. It's hot, she said, but gave the impression that she was on the verge of tears. Exburger hung over her, worried, and the 2 other men pretended to be busy with the view. Lunch followed in due course of time, but, as one might imagine, it was not a vivacious repast. Rose was calm enough now, but she did not pretend that she had returned for a social visit. Without ado, she singled out Exburger at the close of the meal, and they walked away up the road on which Puller had told his story that morning. Left behind, Baumgarten and Styles had that certain manner of strangers who inadvertently have been forced to witness a family quarrel. Baumgarten looked after the 2 doubtfully. I wonder what's the matter with Rose. He said it in tones of a real concern, and Styles did not resent it as he had resented the previous use of her name. He had, in fact, found himself slowly revising his estimates of this man, who had struck him so unpleasantly at the first, this man at whom Exburger shouted in such derision. After his talk with Rose, and after seeing the 2 men opposed to each other, he was not at all sure that Baumgarten was not the finer character. He was, at any rate, the more substantial. Baumgarten had been a totally different man on this visit, more sure of himself, more certain in his control of others. Alone, Styles had found him pathetic, the Broadway type away from his background. Perhaps that was it. He had his background now. A wonderful girl, Mr. Styles. Still Styles did not resent it, and, after all, what right had he to resent it if Rose did not? He wanted to talk about her himself, but, Styles-like, he could only do so by way of a tangent. Exburger, he hinted tactfully, is quite a genius. Baumgarten held his arms at full length and snapped his fingers. A child, Mr. Styles, a child. He had said in one word what Styles had supposed would be utter heresy in the Exburger cult, and Styles looked at him in amazement. "Have you known him long?" he asked. "There's nobody in show business that I don't know," replied Baumgarten. "I've put money in some of his shows, most of 'em, in fact." He paused and grunted, but not ill-naturedly. "Never lost anything by it, and I don't intend to." Strikingly like the judge when a favorite subject had been opened to him, he went on of his own free will. "Charlie is the one you hear about, but Al Siegel, his partner, is the real brains of that concern. Know him?" Styles shook his head. "No," said Baumgarten, "and few people do. He keeps in the dark as much as Charlie keeps in the limelight." "Al Siegel," continued Baumgarten, "has forgotten more than Charlie Exburger will ever know. But there you are. I wouldn't give a nickel to Al if it had a lock on it, but Charlie Exburger could have anything I've got." "Perhaps," suggested Styles, "that in itself is one form of genius." "It may be," replied Baumgarten, but his tone did not sound convinced. He turned and looked at the pair walking back and forth up the road. They might have been in the midst of a summer proposal for the picture they made, and a proposal not very well received. Exburger was walking hatless, his shoulders hunched, his hands in his pockets, talking imploringly, his head making little convulsive jerks. Rose was replying only casually, and from time to time looking away, more often over the fields to her right. The only thing in her view was an isolated and abandoned chicken house, grey, weather-beaten, and falling to pieces, and beyond that a brown field and the ever-present belt of white birches. Did it strike her as queer that one of the moving moments of her life, whatever might be the cause, should be passed in that homely and typical bit of New England landscape, so little like the scenes in which she was accustomed? Or did she take it for granted, giving it no notion at all? It was fair to believe that both of the men there watching her were moved by the same mingled feelings of sympathy and faint pique at their own exclusion. If they were, the older man's longings were those of hope too often rebuffed to be reassuring, the younger man's those of hope too recently born to seem very real. For that moment, the man beside him became the more vivid figure to Styles. In a few curt words, Baumgarten had drawn a picture of himself which, on the surface, was not unlike that which Exburger had drawn of him, but, in the latter, how the values had been distorted by Exburger's naive conceit. By no stretch of the imagination, even the sentimental imagination which Styles possessed in spite of himself, was it possible to make Baumgarten a noble character, even a pleasant one. But it was possible to read a certain crude aspiration into what he was doing and what he was. A man to whom pictures would never mean anything, except those on a card. A man for whose untutored senses music became bad as soon as it became good. A man by whom fame and notoriety were wholly confused. He nevertheless found his glory, his glamour, his aesthetic relaxations among these children of the only art that appealed to his common sense. In awe of them for the very little that they were, which he was not, he stood their rebuffs and fathered their follies, his eyes wide open. And then there was Rose. Rose ought to marry. Like a bombshell, the words had burst into Styles's mediation. Baumgarten had spoken them, but so perfectly had they timed themselves with Styles's own reverie that he actually wondered whether he had been thinking aloud. He had not, however. Baumgarten had merely received the same suggestion that he had received himself from the silhouette of the two figures now disappearing at the turn of the road. "Exburger?" asked Styles. Baumgarten had not meant that necessarily. "She ought to marry somebody," he said. He did not say why, but Styles found the lead an attractive one. "Miss Fuller, I imagine, has made a very great success." He expected to this, at least, immediate and enthusiastic acquiescence. But even the woman he loved But even the woman he loved, this uncountable man, saw with that strange impersonal clearness with which he saw all that romantic profession by which, nevertheless, he allowed himself to be judged a fool. "Rose is funny," he said. "She's a better girl than she is an actress." The surprised expression of Styles's face led him into an explanation still more blunt, but, curiously, not more offensive. "Rose," he explained, "is what you might call a workhorse." The term seemed ludicrously applied to the slender figure coming in sight again at the turn of the road, and even Baumgarten saw that it needed revision. "Oh, Rose is good," he added hastily. "She's very good. She knows how to dance, and she's got a beautiful voice." He hesitated to find the exact words to convey his meaning, but even those words had aroused from Styles a rare and puzzling vision. For a second there flashed before his eyes the picture of Rose in a flopping hat, a basket of flowers on her arm, with high-laced ankles and toes twinkling mischievously to the notes coming over the footlights. For a man who knew as little of comic opera as he did, the picture was a marvelously accurate one. It had the clearness of inspiration, but it lasted only a second. He could not recall it. He had tried it before, but he could not connect that quiet, almost morose girl who had sat in his study with any such picture as that. "Charlie knows it," said Baumgarten. "I guess Rose knows it herself. Rose is good for 300 a week any day. She's a star, all right, but she's just so much of a star that she'll never be any more. Do you know what I mean?" Styles did know approximately, but he wanted to hear more, and Baumgarten was willing to tell him. "There's nobody in the profession has a better name than Rose Fuller, but in the profession, mind you. The public's another kettle of fish. When they get up a show, they try one girl after another, and she makes 'em up of it, and then, when they've got to the end of their rope, they call in Rose and she carries it off. She does it because she knows her business down to the final flip. That's just what happened in The Daisy Chain. That's just what happened in The Girl from Madrid. She's saved more shows than you ever saw, but there you are. Then along comes some chicken with baby eyes and a solid ivory dome who can't dance and can't sing and pulls down 500 a week and fame. When the public goes to one show, they say that they've seen Elsie Flair in The Dancing Girl, and when they go to another, they say that they've seen The Girl from Madrid and that Rose Fuller was in it. Do you get me now?" Styles nodded. It came to him now that there had been more than mere deprecation when Rose had spoken impatiently of her own career. He had even been unwittingly cruel when it had been forced out of him that he knew The Daisy Chain, but knew not her. How depressingly often she must have had just such a conversation before. Like all persons who have not practiced them, he had assumed that to earn a good living in the arts is the same as success. A sudden recollection of Baumgarten's own quixotic offer came to him, and in the same wave of sentimentality which must have prompted Baumgarten himself at the time, he said, "It's too bad. Never mind. If my copper mine only pans out, we'll buy her a theatre of her own." It was a very foolish thing to say, knowing, as he did, the kind of man that Baumgarten really was. The latter flushed. He stared down at the ground, then looked at Styles with little appraising eyes. "Mr. Styles," he said, "you've got something that's worth a damn sight more than that copper mine." Styles searched his face, but Baumgarten never flinched. His gaze was unrelenting, but it was not unfriendly. A suggestion of a smile was even creeping into his eyes. "Oh, don't think I'm going to tell you," he said, "if you don't know it yourself. Hello, Ike. Where did you come from?" Styles turned and saw the forgotten chauffeur running in great excitement over the lawn. Regardless of ceremony, regardless of explanation, he waved his arms and commanded, "Hurry up! You oughtn't to miss it. It's better than a dog fight. I bet there's 100 men and 500 kids got a hold of that rope.
And that, I think, is as good a place as any to stop, albeit on a bit of a cliffhanger. Wow. This. I seem to make usually time. I plowed through 40 pages, didn't I? Oh yeah, the next chapter is 3 pages. But now that I've lost my steam. Hey, Dragon of the West. How are you doing tonight? How many pages did I just read? 40 was my intent. Yep. Yeah, 42. Life, the universe, and everything. Interesting book. These characters keep passing back through, and evidently there's still a great deal more to be learned. This book's longer than I realized. 325 pages. I wonder if it was originally published serialized in a magazine. Not a great deal about it online. Oh, right. You chaps should go out, check out Dragon of the West 412. Plays a variety of games. A lot of them the more modern variety. Interesting book. Really, I'm not giving the characters consistent enough voices, well, some more than others, but it is the downside when you've never read the book before and you only read it once every week or 2 or 3 weeks. My father was always better than that than I was. Reckon we should find somebody to raid and call it a night. As for what's coming up on stream, excuse me, tomorrow, tomorrow, we'll be playing more of the Doom reboot. It's always weird how I start to yawn when I stop either reading or playing the game. Well, yeah, sometimes I yawn when I'm playing the game. Then Saturday, I'll have to find something else for Short Horror Saturday. Try to find something of a different style. Maybe some nice side scroller. And then Sunday? Spud. I don't know what we're going to start. If I don't get Spy Muppets working, I won't know. Oh, but also I have plans on Sunday. I gotta figure out the times and when I'll be able to stream. There's a good chance I will still stream on Sunday. Okay, who's online? We don't get to raid him that often, but you should also see a couple of other people are online. Yeah, let's go ahead and raid Bumfluff Tornado. He's streaming Kingdom Hearts 3, and we don't get to raid him that often. He hasn't been streaming that often. Hey, I keep forgetting he's a VTuber these days. There we go. Well, thank you everybody for coming to hang out. Appreciate everybody coming to lurk as I read strange old books. And you guys can find me on Twitter and MySpace, where I post stream announcements and random other things. And you can find VODs of all my past streams up on YouTube. And I hope that everybody has a good night, or day, or whatever. Good evensong. Get some rest. I'll see you back here tomorrow for exceedingly violent and fast-paced slaughter of demons. And please say hi to Bumfluff Tornado.